Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and since it's the middle of October, we are almost hitting Nonfiction November. Nonfiction November is the nonfiction themed reading event that was created by Olive from A Book Olive. She has a couple of hosts that she's brought on with her this year. I will link to everybody down below. Because I mostly read nonfiction, it's usually not a big change to my reading, but I do love that more booktubers do talk about nonfiction during that month, and I think it's always fun to share some of the nonfiction that I have out of the library, because at any given time I do usually have a big stack. And while I will talk about quite a bit of this in some eventual wrap-up, some of these books I'm only going to be reading bits and pieces of, so I don't know if I will talk about them, but they might be of interest to somebody else, so I thought it would be fun to share them. So first up here I have Hearing Happiness, Deafness Cures in History by Jaipreet Virdi. If you don't follow this author on Twitter and you're interested in disability history in general, you should do yourself a favor and follow her because she posts really interesting history threads. She is an assistant professor of history at the University of Delaware, and this book is a spin-off of some research that she did that was looking into a history of deafness in American society, essentially. She is deaf herself and lowercase d deaf. She was raised in the oralist way, not in the culturally deaf or uppercase D deaf way. So that's her angle of approach in this, and this so far is a split of social history, medical history, and bits and pieces of memoir. So I'm not too far into it, but it is interesting. Another book that I am midway through is The Race for Paradise, an Islamic History of the Crusades. This is by Paul M. Cobb, who is a professor of Islamic history at the University of Pennsylvania. If you have seen, what is it called? The Book of Contemplation, which is in the Penguin Classics Black Spine series. He did the translation of that, which is a first-hand account of the Crusades, translated from Arabic. And that book is a translation of one particular person's experience. This covers a significantly further ground and takes a broader view of the history. I've been picking my way through some other books on the Crusades. I haven't really talked about any of those lately, but it is quite interesting. But if you are interested in the Crusades and you don't want to read some of those first-hand accounts because you feel they're too dry, this is a nice summary of that information from someone who did translate some of the first-hand accounts. Next up, I have How to Hide an Empire, A History of the Greater United States by Daniel Immerwahr. He is an associate professor of history at Northwestern University. I saw Heidi from My Reading Life talking about reading this, and she spoke very highly of it, so I was curious to pick it up. This, I believe, takes a look at the U.S. Overseas possessions, so I'm assuming on the front it shows Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Guam, the U.S. Virgin Islands, Guantanamo Bay, Philippines, etc. Samoa, I assume. Actually, Samoa's not on there, but in any case. So this should be interesting. I think the United States obviously is and has been a colonial power, and for some reason that doesn't seem to be as clearly, it doesn't seem to pop up in discussions of colonialism to the same extent that it does with some of the European and European adjacent powers. So yeah, I don't know. Should be interesting. Lest you think I read nothing but history. Next up I have Hanif Abdurraqib's They Can't Kill Us Until They Kill Us, which I had been thinking was music criticism, but I think it's actually essays on music and culture. I really enjoyed this author's poetry, and he has poetry about specific pop culture moments that I found very recognizable, which I think when you're reading pop culture commentary, it helps to have similar cultural touchstones. So because I think that's an issue in some of the pop culture pieces I've popped up where there are essays which should be interesting, but if I haven't watched the show they're about or listened to the music that they're about, you only get about half of it. Whereas, because from his poetry I'm assuming I'm going to be familiar with most of the stuff he's going to be talking about. So yeah, I'm curious to read this, and something other than the depressing history that I usually read, right? Alright, let's go back to history. Next up I have Tunisia, an Arab Anomaly by Safwan M. Masri, who's the vice president for the Global Development Center at Columbia University. And I think this is meant to be an overview of both the reason that the Arab Spring kind of kicked off in Tunisia, but also kind of a broader overview of the history and what unique bits and commonalities there is within the history compared to some of the neighboring countries. So yeah. So jumping to something that's another non-history. This is a memoir called Mistranslations by Sopan, who is a journalist slash comedian. He had been estranged from his parents, and his parents, I believe, were either divorced or separated at least. and weren't in contact with each other either. And this is a memoir of him getting back in touch with them and working out their relationship to each other and to him. The subheading on this is Meeting the Immigrant Parents Who Raised Me. Yeah, it's short, but I mean, so are most memoirs, right? Alright, speaking of memoirs, next up I have Jessica J. Lee's Two Trees Make a Forest. The subheading on this one is In Search of My Family's Past Among Taiwan's Mountains and Coasts. This author is Canadian from, I think, Vancouver, definitely British Columbia though, although she lives in Germany now. And I believe that this is a memoir in which she goes hiking in Taiwan to connect with her grandparents, I think. Being a fan of both family memoirs and wandering around mountains, I am on board. Next up, I have Kapka Kassabova's To the Lake, A Balkan Journey of War and Peace. This is the same author who wrote Border, A Journey to the Edge of Europe, which I read a couple of years ago and thought was just brilliant. That book was specifically about looking at families who were impacted by the population exchanges, mostly about 100 years later, and she dealt with that in a way that was impressively balanced, because I think most of the time people talk about the population exchanges and people get so nationalistic about it, and obviously that's understandable, but I was just incredibly impressed that she managed to do that. So in any case, this book is a combination of travelogue and family memoir. I believe she's looking at migratory birds and then some of the places where her grandparents lived in Bulgaria. Yeah, it's described as a deep inquiry into how geography and politics imprint themselves upon families and nations. And asking questions about human suffering and the capacity for change. So yeah, I'll be curious to see how this goes, because as I said, very few people can write about the Balkans in a way that's not super nationalistic, and she does it, so. Next up is A Carpet Ride to Khiva, 7 Years on the Silk Road by Christopher Aslan Alexander. This is a travelogue slash memoir detailing 7 years in which the author lived in Uzbekistan. It is shockingly hard to find books about Uzbekistan that are written in English that aren't just travel guides, frankly. I've heard good things about this, and I like a good travelogue, so here we go. And this has clearly been read by many people, so usually that's a good sign. Next up is a book that I've seen a couple of people reading this month because it is Black History Month in the UK, and that is Afropean, Notes from Black Europe. This is written by Johnny Pitts, who is a journalist and photographer, and this is basically him traveling around various cities in primarily Western Europe, I think. I don't know, Moscow is one of the cities mentioned, but other than that, it's pretty much Western Europe, where he meets people who are from the African diaspora in Europe and digs through culture and identity and whatnot. So that should be interesting, and I've heard good things from the people who have been reading this. Oh! My stack of books just fell over. Next up, I have another memoir, and that is Linda Sarsour's We Are Not Here to Be Bystanders. She is an American activist, and she's of Palestinian heritage. This book is forwarded by Harry Belafonte, so I was curious because how many memoirs are forwarded by Harry Belafonte, right? In any case, as with most memoirs, this is not super long, and I'm curious, so why not? Next up, I have a collection of essays by a variety of authors, and that is A Map is Only One Story. 20 writers on immigration, family, and the meaning of home. Immigration stories are always something I'm interested in, and most of the contributors in this are people I haven't read before, and that's always appealing since it's an interesting way to try out people's writing. So I'm curious. I think this is fairly recent. And yeah, this is fairly recent. This came out this year. And finally, I have The Dark Fantastic by Ebony Elizabeth Thomas. The subheading on this one is Race and the Imagination from Harry Potter to the Hunger Games. I saw Jerry from Onyx Pages talk about this a couple of times, and it is an exploration of the role of race in young adult speculative fiction, I think. I will confess, a lot of the stuff that this is about is material that I haven't read, so yes, I am confessing I haven't read Harry Potter or the Hunger Games, sorry. So I don't know how this will work for me, but both of those things are so kind of ever-present in pop culture that I feel like it's not like reading some other pop culture commentary I've seen that's about material I haven't engaged with, so we'll see. Also not that long. Alright, so that is most of the nonfiction that I have out of the library right now. It's already fallen over, and I was too lazy to bring more of them upstairs to film this. In any case, if you've read any of these, I'd love to hear what you think, pro or con. And if you've read anything from the same authors or on similar topics, and you have recommendations on the topics, I would love to hear. In any case, enjoy your nonfiction November once we get there. And yeah, that's it for now. Ciao.